During the Vietnam War, something happened that had never happened before in American history. Soldiers on the front lines started telling the actual story of the war, not the story the military wanted told, but the real one. They were photographers, writers, and journalists embedded with combat units, and what they were documenting was so different from what Americans were seeing on the evening news that it actually started changing how people viewed the entire war. But the military didn't like it. They tried to control these soldiers' stories. They tried to silence them. And some of these GI journalists paid a real price for refusing to shut up.
The Vietnam War was different from any other war America had fought. For the first time, you had television cameras right there on the battlefield. You had photographers capturing images that would reach American living rooms the next day. You had soldiers who had the ability to tell the world what was actually happening in Vietnam, not what the government said was happening. By the late 1960s, there were hundreds of military photographers, military journalists, and embedded reporters capturing the war. Many of them were soldiers themselves, regular GIs who picked up cameras or started writing. But here's what made Vietnam unique. These soldiers' work often contradicted the official story coming from military leadership in the White House. And that contradiction changed everything. That's the story we're diving into today.
When America started getting really involved in Vietnam around 1964, 1965, the military learned something important from earlier wars. You can't stop the press, but you might be able to control them. The Pentagon decided to allow journalists and photographers access to combat zones. This sounds good on the surface. It's transparent, it looks like you have nothing to hide. But here's the catch. They gave preferential treatment to journalists they liked, and they made it harder for journalists who asked tough questions. They controlled where the press could go, what they could photograph, and who they could talk to. They called it the 5 o'clock follies, daily press briefings where military spokespeople would tell the official story of how the war was going. Most of the time, that official story didn't match up with journalists were actually seeing on the ground. And remember, a lot of the people documenting the war weren't independent reporters. They were soldiers, military photographers, guys who were drafted or enlisted to take pictures for the military's own records. These soldiers wore a uniform. They had commanders. They could get in serious trouble if they didn't follow orders. That's where the real tension started. These military photographers and journalists quickly realized something. The war wasn't going the way the military said it was going. The enemy wasn't being defeated like command kept claiming. American troops weren't winning territory and keeping it. And the things happening to civilians in Vietnam, the bombings, the search and destroy missions, the chemical weapons, this wasn't being reported accurately. A lot of these soldiers had joined thinking they were going to document a victory, but instead, they were documenting something way more complicated. They were documenting a war that seemed like it might not be winnable, a war that was destroying villages, a war where the lines between combatants and civilians were blurry, a war that looked completely different from what Americans back home were being told. So these GI journalists faced a choice. They could play along with the military's version of events. They could photograph what they were told to photograph, write what they were approved to write, and just do their job. Or they could start documenting what they actually saw, knowing that might upset their commanders and could get them in trouble. Some of them chose to document the truth.
Let's talk about specific people and situations, because this isn't theoretical. This happened to real soldiers who faced real consequences. One of the most important military photographers during Vietnam was Tim Page. Page was a combat photographer who embedded with American units. He was good at his job, really good. He took photographs that were stunning, powerful, and raw. His work showed the actual experience of being in combat in Vietnam. And his photographs started appearing in major American publications. But here's where it got complicated. Page's photographs were too honest. They showed American soldiers looking scared, exhausted, and shell-shocked. They showed destroyed villages. They showed the chaos of combat in ways that didn't match the military's narrative that the war was under control. Some military officers didn't like it. They thought Page was undermining the war effort. He got hassled. He had limitations placed on where he could go. But Page kept shooting, and he kept finding ways to get his work published. Another important figure was Sean Flynn. Yes, the actor's son. Flynn was a correspondent who was actually captured by the Viet Cong in 1966 and disappeared. But before that happened, Flynn was writing stories that challenged the official military narrative. He was interviewing soldiers who had doubts about the war. He was asking questions that made military leadership uncomfortable. When he disappeared, people wondered if the military even tried very hard to find him. Then you had soldiers like Hugh Thompson Jr., who was a helicopter pilot. Thompson witnessed something in a place called My Lai in March 1968 that would become one of the most infamous events of the entire war. American soldiers were murdering Vietnamese civilians, women, children, old people. It was a massacre, plain and simple. Thompson tried to report what he saw. He told his commanders what was happening. He even landed his helicopter to try to stop it. But the military tried to cover it up. Photographs of My Lai got taken, but they were suppressed for over a year. Soldiers who knew what happened were told to keep quiet. This was exactly what these GI journalists were up against. When they documented atrocities, when they tried to tell the truth about what the American military was doing, they got shut down.
But some soldiers kept the photographs. Some journalists kept their notes. They knew the story would eventually come out, and they wanted to be ready. When the My Lai massacre finally became public in 1969, it was because photographer Ronald Herberly and helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson broke the silence. Their testimony and Herberly's photographs changed how Americans saw the war. There were also soldiers who were documentary filmmakers, guys like Jeff Kane, who was a young filmmaker shooting for the military. Kane started filming combat operations and realized what he was capturing was completely different from what the Pentagon was telling people. He filmed soldiers questioning orders. He filmed the destruction and the chaos. He filmed the humanity of Vietnamese civilians who were caught in the middle of the war. When Kane tried to complete his documentaries with the footage he'd shot, the military blocked him. They didn't want those films shown. Not to the troops, not to the public, nowhere. Kane fought for years after the war just to get his work released. His documentary, Sir, No Sir, took decades to finally see the light of day. And we can't talk about GI journalists in Vietnam without discussing Walter Cronkite. While Cronkite wasn't technically a GI, he was a television journalist who went to Vietnam in 1968 and documented what he saw. Cronkite was trusted by the American public. He was the face of CBS News. When Cronkite came back from Vietnam and essentially told Americans that the war couldn't be won, it shocked people. It contradicted everything the military had been saying. That one journalist's honest assessment changed American public opinion significantly. But that was a network journalist. The GI journalists, the soldiers actually in uniform documenting the war, they didn't have that kind of power. They had to work within the military system. They had commanders. They could get court-martialed.
One soldier who really exemplified this was a guy named Philip Jones Griffiths, a military photographer who documented the war in detail. Griffiths' work was so powerful and so honest that it actually created friction within the military. His photographs showed the human cost of the war in ways that were impossible to spin into a positive narrative. After his service, Griffiths published books of his photographs, and they became historical records of what Vietnam actually looked like, not what the Pentagon said it looked like. There were also journalists embedded with units who started hearing things that contradicted the official reports. They'd be at a military base and hear about a body count that didn't match what was reported in the 5 o'clock follies. They'd interview soldiers who had seen prisoners being executed, which violated the Geneva Convention. They'd document booby traps that American troops were setting up, which put civilians at risk. The truth was darker, messier, and more complicated than the military wanted people to know. Some of these journalists started leaking information to the press. They'd give photographs to reporters. They'd confirm stories that challenged the military's version of events. A lot of them couldn't put their names on this stuff because they were still active duty. They could face punishment. But they did it anyway because they felt like the truth mattered more than following orders. The issue with a body count is especially important to understand. The military used body counts as the main metric for success in Vietnam. They'd say, "We killed 500 enemy soldiers today," and that was how they measured victory. But a lot of GI journalists started realizing that these body counts were inflated or completely made up. Soldiers were being pressured to report higher numbers. Dead civilians were being counted as enemy combatants. The whole system was rigged to make the war look like it was going better than it actually was. Some photographers documented this. They photographed alleged enemy combatants who looked an awful lot like civilians. They documented the chaos of battle, where it was impossible to tell who was who. They captured images that made it clear that the official body counts were probably bogus.
And then there was the issue of the war's effect on civilians. American soldiers were in Vietnam doing search and destroy missions in villages. Civilians were getting killed. Villages were being destroyed. Chemicals were being sprayed that would cause cancer and birth defects for years. GI journalists documented all of this. Photographers took pictures of burned children. Journalists interviewed villagers about American airstrikes that killed their families. These stories and images eventually made it back to America, and they horrified people. Some military photographers got reassigned or had their access restricted because their work was showing this side of the war. Some journalists were told their stories wouldn't be published. The military was actively trying to control what Americans saw and knew about the war. The real turning point came in 1969 and 1970 when the My Lai photographs became public and soldiers started speaking out against the war. By this time, American troops were withdrawing from Vietnam, but the war was still ongoing, and soldiers who had come back to America were starting to tell their own stories. Groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War were organizing. These were guys who had actually fought in the war, and now they were saying it was wrong. They had photographs, they had testimony, they had witnessed atrocities. When these soldier journalists spoke out, when they showed their photographs, when they published their work, it was devastating to the military's narrative. This wasn't some anti-war activist criticizing the war from a college campus. This was a guy who'd been there, who'd seen it, who documented it. This was credible. The military couldn't dismiss these voices as easily. These were war heroes speaking out. And what they were saying was that the war was being fought in ways that violated American values, that the military was lying about what was happening, that the truth needed to come out. Some of these soldier journalists faced real consequences. They got investigated, they got threatened. Some of them got kicked out of the military. But others were protected by the fact that their work had already gone public. It was too late to silence them. This created a fundamental shift in how Americans understood the Vietnam War. The official version, the military's version, was being contradicted by people who had actually been there.
and more of those people were willing to talk. The GI journalists had done their job. They documented the truth. And even though many of them had faced pressure and censorship, that truth eventually came out. The story of the GI journalists during the Vietnam War is really about the power of documentation and the cost of telling the truth. These soldiers were put in an impossible situation. They were part of the military system, which wanted them to document the war in certain ways. But they were also journalists and photographers with training and instincts that told them to document the truth. Those two things conflicted constantly. Some of them compromised. Some of them resisted. Most of them did both at different times. And what came out of their work, the photographs, the stories, the testimony, it changed how we understand the Vietnam War. We have a much fuller, more honest picture of that war than we would have if these GI journalists had just followed orders and kept quiet. The Vietnam War wasn't won by America. It ended badly. American troops left. The South Vietnamese government fell. The war was a failure. And part of the reason Americans came to understand it as a failure was because GI journalists refused to just report the Pentagon's version of events. They documented what was really happening. They preserved the truth. That's not a small thing. That's not just journalism. That's an act of resistance against a system that was trying to control information and control history. The Vietnam War also marked a shift in how America's military would deal with the press afterward. After Vietnam, the military became much more careful about controlling media access. They learned lessons about what happened when the truth got out. In future wars, they'd be more restrictive about where journalists could go, what they could see, and what they could report. But the GI journalists of Vietnam showed that soldiers themselves are journalists. They're witnesses. They have cameras and notebooks and voices. And you can't completely silence them. You can censor them, you can threaten them, you can reassign them. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually, especially when the people who documented it refuse to let it be forgotten. These soldiers risked their careers, their safety, and their freedom to make sure that the Vietnam War would be remembered honestly, not heroically, not as a glorious victory, but honestly, as a complicated, tragic, sometimes shameful chapter of American history. That took courage, that took integrity, and that took a willingness to stand up against the system they were part of.